Globalization, Depoliticization, and Modern Economic Management by Peter Burnham. Bourgeois social science, it has often been remarked, is a real, dedicated follower of fashion. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that when the works of Foucault, Derrida, and Lyotard began to weave their spell into the early 1980s, the new paradigm began to celebrate difference, novelty, and particularity in the micropolitics of subjectivism and empowerment. Whatever the post-structuralist reading, the relativist message was clear. The metanarratives of modernism, especially Marxism, were to be rejected. The discovery by social science of globalization in the 1990s appeared to reintroduce a grand metanarrative, the inexorable march of free markets battering down all Chinese walls. However, it soon became clear that in the hands of paradigm shifters, quote-unquote paradigm shifters, the phenomena of quote-unquote globalization was absolutely compatible with postmodernist ideology. In fact, it complemented perfectly Foucauldian discourse theory. Not only were early assessments of globalization as one logic considered flawed, but it was now claimed that globalization was a process with many logics consistent with the regionalization and decentralization. Above all, globalization signaled the demise of that great modernist symbol of totalizing power, the nation-state. This is, of course, no uncontested definition of globalization. Hegel offers an example of the eclectic international political economy orthodoxy, arguing that globalization represented a. the emergence of a set of sequence and processes that are unhindered by the territorial or jurisdictional barriers, and that indeed enhanced the spread of trans-border practices in economic, political, and social domain, and b. a discourse of political knowledge, offering one view of how to make the postmodern world manageable. Implicit in such a view is the idea that economic interdependence and the power of financial markets in particular has changed the course of modern capitalism, resulting in new structures of global governance. The principal responses to the globalization thesis have been to assert either the call of Ecclesiastes that nothing much has changed, that there are no new things under the sun, or proclaim that all is new, and presumably history is bunk. While skeptics and realists line up to dismiss globalist claims and reassert the power of the state, liberals and postmodernists point to the retreat and even disappearance of the state as the principal form of political authority. In contrast to the often quite sterile debates produced by this realist-liberal encounter, this chapter suggests that a return to classical Marxist ideas on the relation between class, capital, and the state in a global context offers a more productive approach for mapping recent industrial, political, and economic change. I shall argue 3 points. First, most approaches to globalization fail adequately to theorize the relationship between state and markets insofar as they see states and markets as isolated, fragmented aspects of social reality existing in a purely external and contingent manner. The result is the populist and misleading claim that states have lost power to markets. By contrast, Marxist methodology views the relationship as internal and necessary and enables us to understand current changes in terms of the recomposition of an organic whole. Second, it will be argued that processes of international restructuring are undertaken by national states in an intent to reimpose tighter labor discipline and recompose the labor-capital relationship. Global capitalism is still structured as an antagonistic state system, and many of the changes that characterize the global political economy are introduced by states in an attempt to solve problems that have their roots in labor/capital conflict. Finally, I shall argue that the current governing strategies are usefully characterized in terms of depoliticization, involving a shift from discretion to rules in economic policy, a reassertion of the boundaries separating legitimate political, economic, and industrial activity, and a fragmentation, devolution of decision-making in numerous arenas. In terms of key state activities involving the regulation of money and labor, there have been a preference for depoliticized forms of management in the global political economy from the mid-1980s. The language of globalization as depoliticization has enabled state managers to capitalize on changes in the global system, placing the political character of decision-making at one remove, thereby enhancing the efficacy of political implementation. In short, As with much postmodernist ideology, globalization and the associated strategies of depoliticization are neither entirely novel nor signal the end of established sites of power. By contrast, I will argue that these processes are best understood by engaging in historical analysis and by drawing on an heir to classical political economy, the most sophisticated, discredited metanarrative. The first part of the chapter discusses three popular approaches to understanding the changing character of national states in the global political economy. Arguments premised on notions of the post-Fordist state and the new global order withering away of the state and the internationalization of the state are reviewed and found wanting in three main respects. First, they counterimpose the state and the market as two opposed forms of social organization, stressing how globalization gives the market power over the state with a resulting loss of sovereignty and national autonomy. The weakness of this view is that the states and market are conceived in a reified, thing-like manner that excludes the possibility of class analysis. In addition, it precludes conceptualizing states and markets as aspects of a wider and more fundamental set of social relations. Second, the approaches reviewed overestimate the extent to which national states could control capital before 1973. In this sense, by invoking historically inaccurate notions such as the Keynesian welfare state, they support the increasingly implausible idea of a watershed in the global political economy occurring at some point in the 1970s. Finally, they tend to see labor/capital relations as external to the process of restructuring itself, if deserving of a mention at all. The second part of the chapter indicates how an alternative methodology can be derived from Marx, and the final section utilizes aspects of this approach to characterize state and market relations in Britain in the era of globalization in terms of the notion of depoliticization. What's happening to the state in the era of globalization? The post-Fordist thesis. Favored by regulation theorists, state theorists, political sociologists, and many within the field of industrial relations, the notion of post-Fordism has led a charmed existence. Jessup provides the clearest and most sophisticated thesis, claiming that the post-Fordist accumulation regime associated with the internationalization of production now requires the establishment of a now post-Fordist state. The post-Fordist state is hyper-liberal and is increasingly hollowed out from below and above horizontally. Some national state capacities are transferred to pan-regional or international bodies, others devolved to local levels within the national state, and yet others are usurped by emerging horizontal networks, local and regional, which bypass central state and connect localities and regions in several nations. In this form, Jessup's thesis appears determinist and monocausal, and to suffer from the defects of structural functionalism. Admittedly, he does his analysis a thought experiment. State form is derived from the needs of the accumulation regime, and identifying the way in which these needs are met apparently constitutes an explanation of social change and new institutional arrangements. Class relations, and by implication struggle, are viewed as external to the process of restructuring, and the labor and state itself are depicted as powerless, passively responding to the demands of the post-Fordist economy, an ideal type itself rejected by many industrial sociologists. Moreover, the post-Fordism thesis relies on a caricature of historical development predicated on identifying watershed and /sharp breaks in labor, /capital, /state relations, and awkward constructs such as the Keynesian welfare state. For a general critique, see Glenn. In this model, continuous and state policy tend to overlook the novelty of current arrangements as established only by overemphasizing elements of the post-war settlement, which themselves should be more properly be the object of critical analysis. Towards a new global order / withering away of the state. This popular approach builds on aspects of the post-Fordist state argument, combined with liberal transformationist writings, which see the end of the state as nigh. Recent arguments by O'May and Strange point in this direction. This argument is developed, albeit somewhat cautiously, by Held, who notes that the existing strategies and practices of the left are outmoded. Current strategies may have been appropriate for an earlier national stage of capitalism, but these are now rendered obsolete by globalization. The new global order has escaped the democratic control of national governments, and so democracy must now become a transnational affair orchestrated through transnational civil society. There is a clear parallel here with the politics of postmodernism championing the agenda of new social movements. Bureaucratic, hierarchical, and technocratic national forms of politics and representation, including trade unionism, are to be replaced by post-materialist politics based on individual autonomy and self-management. As Bromley sarcastically notes, happily, this politics is at once necessarily fragmented and particularistic, as well as popular and democratic. Yeah, that's a weird irony of all this stuff. It's like they're either be like, yeah, we like micropolitics, and also we like radical democracy, and it's like, it's just a liberal soup, honestly, if you ask me. Again, we are presented with a view of the state as powerless and external to the market, with globalization favoring the market against the ailing democratic state. This extreme version of the market power argument rests on a Fortune magazine / Economist view of international process, which claims, I've never seen someone go that's a hard roast for an academic paper. You know, you have the Economist magazine view of the internationalization process. That's crazy. Which claims seemingly unproblematic that we live in a borderless, stateless world dominated by stateless firms with unlimited global options. This, incidentally, is also the conclusion of Albert's populist account of different models of capitalism, which ends by lamenting that for 100 years or so, the forces of democracy in the nation-state had gradually tamed capitalism, and now the tables have been turned. Divided and disunited, the nation-states and their puny borders can offer no real resistance to the globalized capitalist economy. Capitalism intends to tame the state, eventually it hopes to do without it altogether. Claims about the democratic nature of the state prior to globalization are grossly idealized, as is the capacity of new social movements to displace existing structures of political power and representation. In short, these approaches failed to engage with the state debate of the 1970s and 80s, most penetrating of which underscores both the weakness of rainbow coalitions and the enduring class character of the capitalist state in whatever guise. The internationalization of the state? Of all the recent attempts to understand the changing character of the state, the most thought-provoking is that provided by Cox, who coined the phrase, the internationalization of the state. Cox argues that we are witnessing the transformation, the reorganization of structure and role both internationally and externally, not the destruction of the state. His position rests on 3 points. First, that the states historically have acted as buffers and bulwarks, protecting national economies from disruptive external forces in order to sustain domestic welfare and employment. Since 1975, this priority, he notes, has shifted to one of adopting domestic economies to the perceived exigencies of the world economy. Second, this shift has affected the structures of national governments. Agencies that act as conduits for the world economy have become preeminent within governments. Ministries of Industry and Labor are now subordinates to ministries of finance. Finally, we have a transnational process of consensus formation that transmits guidelines to dominant state agencies, which in turn enact national policies. The state's role is therefore one of helping to adjust the domestic economy to the requirements of the world economy. The state is a transmission belt from which world to domestic economy. It has become internationalized from the outside in. It is a tributary to something greater than the state, orchestrating governance without government. Cox's bold thesis provides suggested themes for future research. However, in typical international political economy fashion, it is largely silent on the issue of labor. This is, of course, somewhat paradoxical, given that, as Sinclair notes, Cox's work stands outside the usual parameters of international relations theory, insofar as Cox develops a critical and historicist epistemology which sought initially to integrate labor into mainstream international political economy. However, the relationship between the problem-solving and critical theory of Cox's work and the difficulties involved in combining Weberian and Marxian methodologies have not been adequately addressed or resolved in many respects. Cox seems to endorse the view that the different methodologies can be selected legitimately to study different chronological periods, even since 1945. Although, therefore, Cox seems to offer a critique of mainstream international political economy, his stance of methodological pluralism produces the same conceptual disaggregation of state and market and theorization of labor as external to restructuring. That is, it present in mainstream IPE. This is reflected in much of his empirical work, which for instance in the case of the cycle of hegemonic stability is barely distinguishable from sophisticated neo-realist accounts. In respect of the internationalization of the state, class relations and by implication struggle are viewed as external to the process of restructuring, and labor and the state itself are depicted as powerless, passively responding to the demand of the post-Fordist economy. In addition, Cox's thesis fails to convince on historical grounds when, since 1900, the states pursue domestic welfare as their central priority. In terms of a theory of policymaking, Cox sanctions a somewhat simplistic fractionalist view of policy, making at behest of fractions of finance capital, and it underplays the extent to which globalization may be authored by the states. And regarded by state agents, both liberal market and social democrat, as one of the most efficient means of restructuring labor/capital relations to manage crises in capitalist society. Although Cox's analysis promises a critical edge, his failure to develop a coherent theory of the state and its relationship to class has important implications for his conceptualization of the global system. In short, by viewing the state and the markets as opposing forms of social organization, with globalization tipping the balance in favor of the market against the state, Cox and most other IPE approaches follow implicitly the liberal/realist position that separates social reality into rigid categories and looks for external linkage between artificially disaggregated phenomena. In this way, much IPE theory resembles not a progression from classical political economy, but a revision to what Marx termed vulgar economy. Despite the trappings of theoretical sophistication, many IPE writers simply produce tautological accounts of state and market, of interdependencies, interaction, influences, and autonomies, which fail to grasp the complex organic set of social relations, which is the global political economy. Reassessing states and markets. Classical political economy in Marx. Tradition of classical political economy sets itself the task as conceptualizing the internal framework of capitalist relations of production, distribution, and exchange. The aim of classical writers, from William Petty to J.S. Mill, was not to describe contemporary events, but to identify the social classes that comprise society, define the economic relationship between these classes, and discover the laws that regulate these relationships. For James Stewart and Adam Smith, the structure of society is conceptualized on the basis of an understanding of its economic foundation. William Robertson provides the classic statement arguing that, in every inquiry concerning the operations of men when united together in society, the first object of attention should be their mode of subsistence. Accordingly, as that varies, their laws and policy must be different. While this orientation may well strike a postmodernist audience as reductionist, it nonetheless offers a conceptualization of social relations which far surpasses globalization theory's description of state and market as opposed forms of social organization. As the heir of the classical tradition, Marx vilified vulgar economists for failing to investigate the real internal framework of bourgeois relations of production. Instead, they are content to flounder around within the apparent framework of those relations, systematizing in a pedantic way and proclaiming for everlasting truths the banal and complacent notions held by the bourgeois agents of production about their own world, which is to them the best possible one. The charge that modern globalization theorists reject conceptualizing the inner relations of capitalist society can be illustrated from Gilpin's magisterial account, where despite the centrality of the concepts of state and market, the author notes whether each developed autonomously, the market gave rise to the state, or the state to the market, are important historical issues, though whose resolution is not really relevant to the argument of this book. Marx, of course, developed his critique of capitalist society through a thoroughgoing assessment of classical political economy. Marx's early economic and philosophical studies led him to question, by method of immanent critique, the naturalistic basis of classical political economy. The error of the classical writers was to naturalize or present as universal the historically specific social relations of capitalist society. Behind the formal abstractions of classical political economy, land, labor, and capitalist producing, rent, wages, and profit, lay an unexamined historically specific postulate, private property. Only by taking for granted the existence of private property could the classical writers assume that classes were derived technically from the division of labor. The best exponents of classical political economy for Marx provided an analysis of value in its magnitude, however incomplete, but failed to ask the vital question: why this content has assumed that particular form. In fact, as Holloway points out, Marx saw the question of form as being the crucial dividing line between his theory and bourgeois approaches, for whom this question of form is meaningless. Capital begins, therefore, with an analysis of the commodity form in order to emphasize, in contrast to the classical writers, that the products of labor only become commodities in historically specific and thereby transitory forms of society. On this historical and materialist basis, Marx builds a theory of capitalist society rooted in the concept of value, surplus value, and class. The isolated individual of liberalism is parodied, since private interest is itself already a socially determined interest, and the symmetrical exchange relation is shown to conceal exploitation, thereby exploding Adams's theory of harmony of interest existing between classes. Capitalist society is based on a particular social form of production within which the production of useful goods is subordinated to the expansion of surplus value, although therefore Marx agrees with the classical writers that the anatomy of civil society is to be sought in political economy. His total reformulation of the classical concept of inaugurated a revolution in social sciences, the result of which has yet to be assimilated by those approaches that seek to explain the novelty of state-market relations in the era of globalization. By counterimposing state and market as opposed to forms of organization, bourgeois globalization theories are not simply committing an empirical error, but rather they're endorsing a conceptualization of society that has its basis in the marginalist revolution in economic theory. The end of the 19th century saw the rise of the marginal utility theories of Stanley Jevons and the Austrian school under Karl Menger. The marginalists redefined economics as a branch of praxeology, the science of rational action, in an attempt to introduce a more scientific and mathematically precise, disciplined political economy as an economic theory of society, becoming positive economics. Defined later by Robbins as the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and the scarce means which have alternative uses. Economics could now be narrowly interpreted as an isolated study of utility maximizing individuals expressing their subjective preferences in a taken for granted market situation. As Perlman notes, the replacement of political economy by positive economics actually constituted an omission of a field of knowledge, a headlong dash from reality, in effect a great evasion. This left space for the growth of complementary disciplines, each established in relation to a specific, irreducible type of action, social action, and political action. The organic study of law, government, and society on the basis of the mode of subsistence as undertaken by the classical writers became a much more narrow and politically conservative study of the determination of price and resource allocation in accordance with individual choice. The methodology of modern globalization theory has been established in accord with the marginalist revolution, reproducing its fragmented, ahistorical character. One of the great strengths of Marxism is that it rejects this fragmentation. It rejects the fetishism, rigidity, and fixity of the concepts of modern social sciences, such as the state and the market, dissolving these in the categories of human social practice, however alien and perverted these practices might be. Rather, therefore, than viewing the relationship between state and market as external and contingent, Marx's approach places the antagonistic class relations at the center of analysis and starts from the premise that the relationship between states and market is internal and necessary, although of course the institutional form of this relationship varies given the historical character of class struggle. States are an aspect of the social relations of production, a historically specific and differentiated form of those relations, and their power derives from their ability to reorganize labor and capital relations within and often beyond their boundaries to enhance the accumulation of capital, both domestically and globally, from its greater elaboration, see Holloway and Picciotto, and contributions to Clark. This interpretation of Marx's approach to the state has been developed most consistently under the auspice of the Conference for Socialist Economics and in the journal Capital and Class. Rooted in Marx's account of the fetishism of commodities, this approach dissolves the state as a category and sees it as a rigidified or fetishized form of social relations. National states exist as political nodes or moments in the global flow of capital, and their development is therefore part of the antagonistic and crisis-ridden development of the capitalist society. As Bukharin argued, I didn't expect him to show up here, Early in the 20th century, the struggle between national states, which is nothing but the struggle between respective groups of bourgeoisie, is not suspended in mid-air, but is conditioned by the special medium in which the national economic organisms live and grow, the world economy. National political economies and the social division of labor within them exist only as part of the world economy and thereby of an intermediate division of labor. Individual states may seek to alter the character of their integration into the world economy through the route of production, trade, and finance, but they remain circumscribed by their ability to enhance accumulation and manage class struggle in both international and domestic arsenals. Thus, Marx's approach does not reject the state as a category in favor of a new social movement, but rather sees relations between national states in terms of the social relationship which constitutes state as moments of the global composition of class relation. In contrast, therefore, to theories that equate the end of the state with the demise of particular institutional characteristics, Marxist methodology draws attention to the political form and highlights that the management of labor and money are the central axes of state intervention in capitalist societies. In many instances, as de Burnham points out, monetary policy as a form of managing crisis has functioned historically as a means of organizing recession in order to establish a new subordinate of nation of labor to capitalist command. The remainder of this chapter will indicate how it is possible to build on this approach to conceptualize recent changes in state-labor-capital relations in Britain in terms of the politics of incorporation, politicization, and depoliticization. Unlike the approaches detailed above, which assume a state versus market model, the following account shows how marketization also benefits state managers and how the market-driven policies, in a global context, enhance the process of governing vis-a-vis the working class. It will be argued that the real significance of the shift from discretion to rules lies in how state managers use the language of external commitments and globalization to legitimate the recomposition of labor-capital relations in the guise of global competitiveness. Depoliticization and modern economic management in Britain. From 1945 to the mid-1980s, successive British governments adopted the politics of incorporation to manage labor and money. This required increasingly elaborate state intervention to persuade business, trade unions, and others to moderate wage demands in the context of relatively full employment. The product, largely of fortuitous structural conditions, as the Treasury was later to admit. Successive administrations sought to regulate labor through moral exhortation in the national interest, increasing the exercise of centralized authority over wage determination, and through the creation of new surveillance and guidance machinery. In many key respects, the story of the state policy in the post-war period confirms the view of Kalecki that the lasting full employment is unsound from the government's point of view, causing particular social and political problems, and that large-scale unemployment is in many important respects an integral part of the smooth operation of the capitalist economy. By 1975, it was clear that politicized management had been far from successful. A special Treasury study of government wage policy concluded, it can hardly be argued that our income policy has kept our degree of inflation lower than that of our neighbors, and until very recently, it cannot be plausibly asserted that important price problems had unfairly prejudiced our success. Moreover, it cannot be said that the policy has found a formula for a fair or efficient distribution of incomes. Nor is there, in spite of the National Board for Prices and Incomes efforts, any evidence that restraint assisted either economic growth or economic efficiency. Income policies must therefore to date be judged a failure. It was clear by the time that the economic circumstances that had given rise to relatively full employment in Western Europe had changed, the return of large-scale unemployment, fiscal crisis, and the volatility introduced by the switch to floating exchange rates and the re-regulation of financial markets enabled the British state to reassess its approach to the regulation of labor and money. Kalecki had argued, in the early 1940s, the assumption that a government will maintain full employment in a capitalist economy if only it knew how to do so is fallacious. Under a regime of permanent full employment, the SAC ceases to play its role as a disciplinary measure, and the stronger bargaining power of the worker is likely to increase political instability and lead to problems associated with political overload and ungovernability. The ability of the state to successfully pursue anti-inflationary policies and conditions of relative full employment is circumscribed fundamentally by the relationship that can be established between government, union, and employers associations, and the relationship between the latter groups and its members. In such circumstances, the implementation of anti-inflationary policies will always threaten to heighten class conflict and ultimately risk the danger that an economic or industrial crisis will become a crisis of political authority itself. This occurred explicitly in the British case, with the state's attempt to reconcile the conflicting aspirations of capital and the working class, resulting increasingly in the struggles over the extent of state intervention. One of the most important lessons of the 1920s was that by switching from discretion to rules in economic policy, governments could externalize the imposition of financial discipline on labor and capital. The stronger and more distant the set of rules, the greater maneuverability the state would achieve, increasingly the likelihood of attaining objectives. This was the logic behind Britain's return to the gold standard in spring 1925 as a pre-war parity of $1 for $4.86. The move was subjected to a devastating critique by John Maynard Keynes, who argued that the pre-war parity was too high and would impose painful and useless deflation on the British economy. Leading to supporters of the return to gold, in particular John Bradbury and Otto Niemeyer in the Treasury, were adamant that the gold standard would make the British economy knave-proof, free of manipulation for political or even unworthy reasons. In effect, it was judged that the gold standard, with its automatic corrective mechanism, was the best guarantee against inflation. Similar arguments were employed by critics of the conservative regime of politicized management in the 1950s. Supporters of Operation Robot Plan argued that the role of the market should prevail over interventionist management, and if the workers finding their food dearer are inclined to demand higher wages, this will have to be stopped by increasing unemployment until their bargaining power is destroyed. The experience of the 1920s and the criticism voiced in the 1950s were finally heeded in the 1990s in a context where the regulation of financial markets strengthened arguments favoring the implementation of depoliticized rule-based policies. The re-regulation of financial markets increased capital mobility and the creation of a genuinely integrated global market, which began in earnest in October 1979. With the abolition of the 40-year-old system of exchange controls in Britain affected significantly the fiscal and monetary choices open to the governments, since foreign exchange dealers prefer to hold currencies backed by anti-inflationary policies. The search for counter-inflationary credibility is of paramount importance, both rhetorically and materially. Well, in the post-war era, as Thompson indicates, currency markets were driven largely by current accounts of balances. Now interest rates differentials are the prime determinant of exchange rate movements. The 1980s and 90s have seen a general convergence in interest rates, and any state that adopts a significantly looser monetary policy than the prevailing level risks a depreciation in its currency. Since the sheer scale of flows in the foreign exchange market rules out reserve intervention as anything more than a short-term policy, monetary policy is for the moment inextricably tied to exchange rate management. The net result of this fiscal and monetary environment is that governments have a clear incentive to enhance their counter-inflationary credibility. It is common to view these developments as giving power to markets over states, and this informs many discussions about the novelty of current arrangements. An alternative, however, would be to see the re-regulation of financial markets as providing the strongest possible public justification governments can muster for maintaining downward pressure on wages to combat inflation and thereby achieve price stability. State managers were of course responsible for the creation of the euro currency markets, and that developed largely out of interstate rivalry focused on finance. In many key ways, therefore, the re-regulation of financial markets enhances the power of the state vis-a-vis the working class, since it can be argued forcefully that price stability really is the crucial determinant in the global economy, and the lack of competitiveness translates directly into a loss of jobs and profits. Globalization, in this sense, is far from being a mere ideology. In the current environment, where the maintenance of price stability is publicly acknowledged as the first objective of monetary policy, the high wage settlements are seen as major cause of inflation. Governments in advanced capitalist states across the world have attempted to control inflation by adopting rules-based approaches than discretion-based economic strategies. Rules-based approaches attempt to build counter-inflationary mechanisms into the economy by reordering parts of the government's responsibility for economic policy on the non-governmental bodies. This can be achieved in two ways. First, by reassigning tasks to an international regime, usually an international monetary mechanism, which sets definite rules. This attempt to build automaticity into the system by formally limiting government rooms for maneuver. Second, by reassigning tasks to a national body, which is given a definite role in the status and thereby greater independence from the government, for example, moves towards central bank independence, complemented by fiscal responsibility codes. Whereas rules-based strategies are attempts to depoliticize the government's economic policy making, thereby shielding the government from the political consequences of pursuing deflationary policies, discretion-based approaches are highly politicized since the national government plays a central role in controlling inflation, usually through formal income policies. In the 1990s, depoliticization strategies have accompanied the increasing internationalism of capital. It is important to be aware that the term depoliticization, as used in this chapter, should not be taken to mean the direct removal of politics from social and economic spheres, or the simple withdrawal of political influence. Rather, depoliticization is highly political. In essence, it is the process of placing at one remove the political character of decision-making. In many respects, state managers retain arm's-length control over crucial economic processes while benefiting from distant effects of depoliticization. Furthermore, depoliticization strategies invariably require the public rejigging of bureaucratic practices to achieve their primary aim, which is to change expectations regarding the effectiveness and credibility of policy making. In this sense, depoliticization is not simply an ideology unrelated to material practice, but rather is one of the most potent forms of ideological mobilization, reflecting changes in the form in which state policy making is carried out, capitalizing thereby on the ideological effects of changed material practice. In short, it is a move to construct new public perceptions concerning neutrality, thereby boosting the credibility of the state. As a government technique, depoliticization is evident in three aspects of the British government policy in the 1990s. First, there's been a reassignment of tasks away from the party in office to a number of ostensibly non-political bodies as a way of underwriting the government's commitment to achieving objectives. The most obvious example in this regard is the government's move to grant operational independence in the area of monetary policy to the Bank of England. On 8 October 1992, in a memo to the House of Commons Treasury and Civil Service Committee, Norman Lamont sets out the policy framework that would replace the ERM. Counter-inflationary credibility would now be sought by restructuring the institutional relationship between the Treasury and the Bank of England in order to maintain the formation of policy more transparent and our decision-making accountable. In November 1992, Lamont set an inflation target of 1 to 4% and asked the bank to assess inflation prospects in quarterly independent reports. With Kenneth Clark as chancellor in May 1993, the bank was given the right to decide the timing of interest rate changes. Finally, in February 1994, Clark outlined a new framework for monetary policy decision-making. Decisions concerning interest rates would be taken as a meetings between the chancellor and the governor, and minutes will be published with some time delay. Well-publicized disputes between the chancellor and the governor during major administration questions, and the extent to which these healthy moves towards central bank independence constituted an effective counter-inflationary anchor. The response of the government in 1995 was to review recommendations to enshrine price stability and statute as the primary objective of monetary policy, and followed the Bank of France by creating an independent monetary policy committee within the bank to oversee the making of a policy. In the wake of Blair's victory in May 1997, New Labour completed the reforms begun by Lamont and Clark. The move to introduce operational independence, broadly along the lines of the New Zealand model, has now left the bank free to pursue an inflation target laid down by a 9-person monetary policy committee. In respect to the management of labor, the reassignment of tasks away from the party in office is evident first in the legislative marginalization of trade unions, next in government-sponsored union use of the legal system, which switches attention away from the public, from government to the law courts, and finally to the reorganization of the public sector and the emergence of the so-called new public management. The second form in which depoliticization has been manifest in Britain in the 1990s is in the adoption of measures to ostensibly increase the accountability, transparency, and external validation of policy. Recent moves to establish a code for fiscal stability based on the fiscal responsibility codes created in New Zealand and the government's intention to create a conjuncture with the world market and the OECD, a code of good practice for openness and transparency in macroeconomic policy, both exemplify this trend. In July 1997, the Blair government tied fiscal policy to two rules. First, over the economic cycle, and the government would only borrow to invest. Public consumption would therefore be paid for by taxation. Second, the government would ensure that the level of public debt as a proportion of national income would be held at a stable and prudent level. Building on this framework, the government announced in March 1998 that its fiscal rules must be seen to represent a credible commitment in the eyes of the public. To make this commitment visible, the Chancellor proposed that the code be enshrined in legislation to rule out the possibilities of profligate fiscal behavior and so that the government can be held accountable for their policy decisions. At the heart of the code stand 5 principles of fiscal policy management: transparency in the setting of fiscal objectives, implementation of policy, and the presentation of results, stability in policy making and the impact of fiscal policy, responsibility in the management of public finances, fairness not least between generations, and efficiency in managing both sides of the public sector balance sheet. To achieve these objectives, and more importantly, to indicate in public how specific policies related to declared principles, the government had drawn up plans to recast the financial statement and budget report to include its key operating assumptions and to explain discrepancies between outcomes in previous budget forecasts, and introduce an economic and fiscal strategy report reconciling short and long-term fiscal strategy. In addition to enhance accountability and transparency, the government proposes a closer involvement of the National Audit Office to police key assumptions and conventions underpinning economic policy. In short, through these measures justified in terms of openness and accountability, the government aims both to alter expectation of key actors, in particular public sector trade unionists, and insulate itself from the consequences of tight fiscal policies. Finally, depoliticization strategies have been pursued in an overall context favoring the adoption of binding rules that limit government room for maneuver. Throughout Europe, this is clearly seen in the preference for the fixed exchange rate management system, the centerpiece of which is the ERM, and the convergence rules of governing the move to stage 3 of European Monetary Union. In Britain, in late 1989, membership of the ERM was advocated as best possible means of securing low inflation while shielding the government from the impact of recession. Major and Lawson agreed with the Bank of England in the early 1990s that Britain would reap substantial benefits from joining the ERM. In particular, by ruling out periodic exchange rate realignment, both sides of industry, in Major's view, would be forced to face the long-standing problem of inflationary wage settlements. Thatcher's remedy for the 1980s that policy should focus on the control of monetary aggregates, the medium-term financial strategy, weakened as the government found increasing difficulty in controlling the money supply and as different measures of money contradicted each other. The prerequisite for sustained ERM membership was a reduction in unit labor costs through lower wages and the intensification of work. With inflation rising, the ERM offered the government the opportunity to have monetary discipline implemented from without. Clearly, the Major administration hoped it could be insulated from the unpalatable consequences of economic adjustment by joining an international regime constructed on the basis of binding rules. ERM membership, the government hoped, would force employers to compensate for the high interest rate pressure on profit by confronting the labor force to secure low wage rates and increase output per worker. A falling exchange rate would no longer compensate sluggish productivity or enable wage negotiators to agree on acceptable high claims. In essence, the ERM replayed the episode of Britain's return to the gold standard in 1925. The politics of austerity could now be legitimized in the language of globalization, with rules and external commitments uppermost in many respects and from the viewpoint of the governors. Euro membership worked, inflation fell from 10.9% in October 1990 to 3.7% by September 1992. Lamont heralded the sea change in attitudes to inflation that occurred in Britain, particularly among trade union leaders, since joining the wide band in October 1990, but above all else, this act of depoliticization enabled Major to preside over the second worst recession since World War II and survive for a further term of office. In a wider context, the adoption of rule-based strategies is also evident in the government's support for new international institutions, such as the World Trade Organization, and in particular, the linchpin of the organization, its dispute settlement mechanism, which seeks to integrate previously disparate settlement procedures and enforce the rules of the World Trade Organization. The argument of this chapter has been that by retaining a conceptualization of the internal and necessary relations between labor, state, and capital, it is possible to avoid the vague generalizations about the future of the state which abound in globalization studies. It is more productive, I suggested, to analyze the politics of state management, which in the 1990s seemed to be characterized by a number of depoliticization strategies accompanying the internationalization process. The recomposition of the global circuits of productive commodity and money capital, popularly understood as globalization, has not fundamentally transformed the character of the capitalist political economy. Despite talk of economic miracles or new paradigms, the principal problems facing both the government and capital have not changed. Okay, so to finish off here, I will summarize, I think, the key takeaways from this essay. So, bourgeois social science follows intellectual fashion. And you see this in how postmodernism celebrates difference, novelty, and rejection of metanarratives of modernism, especially Marxism. Globalization discourse looked like a new grand theory, but ends up fitting postmodernism because of its view that globalization as a signal for the demise of the nation-state. It claims that the states have lost power to the markets, and consequently posits both as separate forces. But in reality, globalization is driven by states trying to reimpose tighter labor discipline and recompose the labor-capital relationship. Modern governments increasingly rule through depoliticization, which is a shift from discretion to rules in economic policy and the fragmentation of decision-making. The language of globalization helps governments hide political decisions by placing the political character of decision-making at a further layer of abstraction. Post-Fordist theory portrays labor and the state as powerless forces that passively respond to the demands of the economy. These views end up exaggerating the decline of nation-states and idealizing the new social movement that forms in its wake, and as a result, they end up treating labor and class struggle as an external to the process of restructuring. The relationship between the state and the market is internal and necessary, rooted in class relations. States are not outside capital, but are political nodes of the global flow of capital. The core role of the capitalist state is the management of labor and money, especially through crises management in labor discipline. Post-war Britain used the politics of incorporation wage controls, negotiation with unions, and state management to regulate labor and inflation. By the 1970s, this politicized management was judged a failure. Income policy must therefore, to date, be judged a failure. The solution was depoliticized neoliberal management. Government shifted authority to rules-based systems like central bank independence, exchange rate mechanisms, and fiscal rules, so austerity and labor discipline could appear imposed by external commitments and global competitiveness rather than by political choice itself. And the next one in this series is The Spectre of Globalization on the Form and Content of the World Market by Werner Bonefeld.